Yeah, so for the past few lectures, we have been looking at how we use ideas from linear algebra in machine learning. So, once again, the ideas that we use are very, very simple. They are not sophisticated in any way. Right. So, once again, we have these new things which are, well, not new things, but popular things right now, which are neural networks. So, today we are going to see how ideas from machine learning are used in neural networks. So, I mean it is everywhere essentially. So, as I said, you start off with your input is essentially some vector or some matrix. So, let us stick with the notion of matrix here, because we will go ahead and look at images in some sense. So, the way these neural networks work is that, well, okay. So, what is a neuron essentially? It's a linear function essentially, which is like this. So, let us say if I have some input vector which I will write as x1, x2, xn, then the key thing in a neuron, and let me write some neuron as so pictorial, it is represented like this, right. So, there is this neuron which will take the way I have written this, better to move the circle down there. Right. So, these things, like the picture you usually see, it is sort of like this, right. So, what is happening here is that you are computing the following value, you are computing some, let us say a1 x1 plus a2 x2 and so on, an xn plus b. This is the value you are computing. So, this I will write. So, if I consider this input as this vector or something x, then this is basically, this is the value, say f of x, right. So, this is a single neuron, it is computing this value, right. But actually neurons are not just linear things, it is just this, but on top of this you have some other function which is some non-linear function, and the final output of the neuron is basically the sigma of f of x, right. It is a single number, right. So, if you forget about the sigma, which is a non-linear function for now, most of this neuron, it is linear, right. I mean it is built around just computing a simple linear function, right. So, a neural network will be basically it is sort of like this. You have your input, which I am writing in vector form here. You have a layer of these neurons, which is just multiple neurons, and each neuron takes this input and computes some function like this, right. So, every neuron computes some function, essentially a linear function of the input, right. And this, the output of each of these guys, that forms my sort of a next input. So, the second layer of neurons will take the output of the first layer of neurons and once again compute a function like this, right. So, the output of all the neurons in the first layer, that is once again a vector, right, and the length of this vector is whatever the number of neurons were there. Yeah. So, then the second layer of neuron takes that vector as input, right, and then you will have a third layer of neurons which will take the output of the second layer of neurons as input, right, and so on. So, this is how neural networks work. Now, if I were to sort of try to understand the action of a single layer, right, then how would I think of this? So, if I had my input was, let me write x1, x2, xn. So, this is my input, right. So, I will have some neuron here, right. So, what does this neuron compute? It will compute, let us say some let us give this one a name, let us call it a1. Okay. So, then this neuron computes, or not a1, but rather I wanted to say let us say this is the first neuron, right. So, let us okay, I do not know, I do not need a name here, but the function it computes would be, if you forget the sigma thing for now, first it computing this function which I will denote by a11 x1 plus a12 x2 plus a1 n x n plus b1. This is the value it computes. Right. The second neuron is computing a21 x1, a22 x2, a2n xn plus b2. Right. So, if I have some m neurons here, right. So, if I have some m neurons here, this last one will compute a m1 x1 plus a m2 x2 and so on up to a m n xn plus b m. Right. So, if I had m neurons in this layer, then the linear part of the neuron, at least each of these neurons will compute these individual functions. Right. So, how can I represent this whole thing compactly using linear algebra? Right. So, if this is thought of as a vector x, then I can think of these guys as a matrix A, right. This is a matrix A with how many rows and how many columns? Is it m cross n? Well, yeah. So, let us just write m plus 1 cross n, right, and x has an extra, let us say 1 appended at the bottom, right. So, then we can represent this whole thing as a, I mean this is x essentially. Sorry? Oh, right. Yeah, you are right. Correct. Yeah, I always get the dimensions wrong. Right. So, then I can write down the output vector here as a times x, that is fair, right, and the dimension of the output is, I mean it is a m length vector. Right. And again, I mean just for the purpose of the next layer I have to append a 1 at the bottom and proceed, but the whole thing basically proceeds by matrix multiplication over and over again, right. So, these BIs are some extra term that are called biases. If you do not have these BIs, right, then essentially, I mean these just okay. So, this is just an extra term called biases, let us just say that is present everywhere, right. As in this influences the this makes it a general linear function of the input in some sense. Otherwise, you will be restricted to if you set all the xi's to be 0, the output will be 0, right. So, it will basically be defining some sort of a line or hyperplane or something, but this allows it to define almost anything, right. Now, if you recall, we had this perceptron algorithm, right. So, I mean there was an algorithm to compute the classifier in that perceptron, right, but the format of that thing was also just like this, right. Yeah, so, I mean perceptron is another I guess word or something that comes out of neural networks. I mean the whole thing is inspired by biology, although they are not really equivalent. Biology is much more complex, but if you look at a single neuron here, right, the single neuron sort of behaves like it's quite similar to the perceptron, except that in the perceptron the idea was that you compute this linear function, then you look at the output. If the sign is positive, your output is +1, if the sign is negative, the output is -1. So, here so that was like a specific choice of some nonlinear function applied on top of the linear function in the perceptron, right, which was just the sine function applied on top of a linear function. So, here we can apply any other linear function. So, it is not just a dot x, but it is like some other function applied, which I denote by sigma, applied on a dot x, and this is a nonlinear function for a reason which we will just see right away. But just to complete the description, this is the output of a single layer of a neural network, and then this is fed to another layer. So, I can sort of maybe write it as, if the matrix for that second layer was B, then I would write it as B multiplied by this vector, and then maybe another sigma applied on top of it. Let me write sigma prime not to confuse you. Right. So, in neural networks generally we fix the same nonlinear function, and after this linear layer, right, we apply the same nonlinear function almost to all neurons and all that, right. So, there is no reason to do that, but this is what people do, right, they keep things simple. You don't need to mix and match different types of complicated nonlinear functions to do anything, right. Just as you fix your choice of nonlinear function, and that is good enough. So, what nonlinear functions are used nowadays? The most common, yeah.
Sir, please explain the last expression.
This last expression. Okay, I'll come to this. I'll come to this last expression. Let me erase this for now. I'll come back to this. Yeah.
Okay.
For now, just you have one layer. Right? Let me just finish the description of this sigma function. So, as I said, sigma is acting on this vector, right? It's acting pointwise, right? Sigma, for all practical purposes, is a function from real numbers to real numbers. Okay. So, when I am applying it to a vector, the function is being applied pointwise. Right? It's a slight abuse of notation, but it's easy to understand and everyone gets it, right. And here sigma, the most common choice of sigma nowadays is so called ReLU, which if I plot will look like this, right. Okay. So, for all negative numbers, if the input is negative, then sigma of any negative number is 0, and sigma of any positive, say, number x is equal to x. Right. So, this is the most popular choice of of this nonlinear function used in neural networks. It is called an activation function. So, I will come to why it is required in the next slide, but as you can see, the function is very simple. Now, this function has a flaw, which is that it is not differentiable at 0, which becomes important in other aspects. Specifically, these networks, you generally describe the structure as I am doing now, right. You specify that first layer will have 100 neurons, second layer will have 50 neurons, things like that, and then you do not specify like these values that are there, right. This A11, A12, okay, and so on. These values are not specified by humans. This is something that you learn during this training process, right. Like we had the perceptron. So, it eventually turned out that the perceptron, the classifier there, it was like some summation of the input vectors, right. But we did not figure out that vector by hand, but rather we had an algorithm which would have computed that vector, right, and the algorithm did something, whatever it is. Same way, we will have a training data set, and that training data set, based on that we will run some algorithm, and that algorithm will figure out some values for these guys, right. And that would give us the neural network that we are going to use, right. So, the training process uses this very general optimization algorithm called gradient descent, and then like further things built on top of it. Gradient descent, if you do not know, it is simply that if you have a training data set, right, and you want the output of the neural network to match with whatever it is that you have, right. So, I mean your input data is some vector, and let us say something, maybe it is some class or some value or something, right. So, initially if you just say, let us say randomly initialize all these values initially, right, maybe or set them to 0 or whatever you do. So, when you apply this untrained neural network to your training data, right, for each input in the training data set, it will produce some output which may or may not be correct. Now, based on the outputs for all the elements in the training data set, you define some function. Let us say you just count the number of errors or something, right. So, that is called your loss function. Now, what you would like to do is minimize the value of that loss function, and to do that, what do you do? One simple thing, which a simple optimization algorithm, is that you find the gradient of this loss function with respect to each of these things here, which is A11, A12, and all the thousands of these numbers that you need to figure out. So, for each guy you can figure out the partial derivative of the loss function with respect to that guy, right, and you update each of these guys by moving along the direction opposite to the partial derivative, right, because derivative sort of says that if you increase the value, then the value change like that, right. So, if you go in the opposite direction, then the value will reduce over there. So, I mean gradient descent is not the focus of what we are doing here, but this is the way that these networks are trained, just for a quick intro, right. Okay. So, now this is like a very quick overview of neural networks. So, now coming back to why we need an activation function, the reason is like this. So, here is my input, right, and then I can write down, or why do I do this? Okay, first let me explain maybe what do I mean by this. So, here is my input, which is some like n length vector or something. Then this is the first layer, right, with some m neurons. Then I have a second layer, right. So, the input to the second layer, just like the input to the first layer is this vector x, right. The input to the second layer is the output of the first vector, first neural network, right, which we denoted as sigma of a of x, right. So, if I call this x prime, then the second layer will compute some function which we may write as b times x prime, and then sigma applied on top of it, right. So, this will again be a vector which I will call x double prime. Then if I had a third layer in my neural network, then here it will be, let us say, some matrix C. So, this is C x double prime and sigma applied on top of it, which I will call x triple prime, something like that, right. So, if I basically just substitute the values for what is x prime, what is x double prime and so on, then the output, the thing that is being computed here is x double prime equal to sigma of b of sigma of a of x. Very straightforward, right? There is no fancy thing happening here. And then the third layer you will substitute, you will get a longer expression inside here, and so on. Right. So, a neural network is simply this. This is just a sequence of like layers of multiple neurons, and the input goes from here to here to here to here to here, and finally, there is some final layer, right, based on which you compute something. Right. So, the final output vector, if I call it some x star, right, the output of the final layer. So, maybe x star itself is treated as some class or whatever you want to say, or something else, right, but this is the output of my neural network. So, x star is the output of my neural network given input x. Okay. Now, what x star is will depend exactly on the problem that we are trying to solve, right, if it is a classification problem or this problem or that problem. So, we will interpret, or we will decide the structure and the values of x star accordingly, but the output is this, right. So, neural networks, as you can see, are very easy to understand, there is nothing fancy happening, right. Now, the question comes is why do we need this activation, nonlinear activation function? Everything was linear, it was so nice, right. So, can anyone guess why we need this, looking at this picture?
To increase the accuracy faster, because
Okay.
initially it was everything was in linear form, so the error will decrease linearly if we use gradient descent kind of thing.
No, that is not quite accurate now. Any other ideas? So, what happens if we did not have this nonlinear activation function? What will happen? Yeah, so okay, so let me answer the question. See, if you did not have the sigma, let us say computation of x double prime here, right, then what is x double prime? X double prime is simply b applied to ax, right. What is b? Sorry? No, B is a matrix, is what I mean, and A is a matrix. So, B times A times x, right. What is B times A times x? That is basically just matrix multiplied with matrix multiplied with vector. Right. So, matrix times matrix is another matrix, right. So, I might as well have just written down one layer. Why did I need two layers, right? So, if you did not have the nonlinear function, then your neural network will only be able to compute linear functions, no matter how many layers you stack, right. So, therefore, the neural network is not going to be stronger than the perceptron, for example, right? It will remain at that level only, right. So, this is the reason you need some sort of a nonlinear activation function, and mathematically this sigma can be any nonlinear function, as long as it is nonlinear it is good enough, right. You can in fact prove that whatever function that you could want to compute could be computed by a neural network with a nonlinear, with any nonlinear activation function effectively. So, this is called a universal well approximation theorem, but you can approximate any function on this vector x to any arbitrary degree using neural networks, as long as your activation function is nonlinear, right. So, this is the reason that we need this unfortunate nonlinear thing sitting here, because once you put this nonlinear thing, I mean it is no longer well linear algebra, right. Although many insights from linear algebra can be used while working with these things, the setup itself changes quite a bit, right. Okay. So, before I move on, are there any questions here? I mean I skipped over a lot of details, but I did mention the key thing, which is that neural networks are basically a sequence of almost linear functions applied to an input, right, and you cannot wish away the nonlinearity here, although you can reduce it down to sort of bare minimum, like this that activation function I showed you here. So, this activation function it is called ReLU, right, or yeah, they have some arbitrary names, let us just say. So, you can think of, you can see that this function is basically a very simple function, right.
How do we get the AIKs and PIs?
Yeah. So, if you have this neural network with the activation function, all that. So, notice that activation function itself has no parameters, right, it is a fixed function, right. If it gets a negative number it says 0, if it gets a positive number it just outputs that number. So, what is not specified is here, like what should be the entries of this matrix A and that matrix B and C and so on, right. So, the way we train the neural network is that we have some training data set where we have some pairs, right, we have pairs of x and some target, let us call it y, right. So, what I will do is that I will take a particular x and feed it to the current neural network, it will produce some x star, right, and then I will have some function which will compare the value y and x star, right. Now, if y and x star were essentially the same, then the output of that function would be close to 0. If they are very different, it would be some large number, okay, large positive number. Okay. So, this is called the loss of this neural network on this input. Now, I can have loss function values computed over the entire training data set, right. Essentially just take all of them, add them up and average, right, process all the x y pairs one by one and average out the final loss value, right. So, this is my aggregate loss function. Now, what do I want? I want the loss function to go down, right, because if the loss function becomes very close to 0, then for an input x, the x star that is computed is close to y, which is what we want. So, how do you do that? So, as I was saying, so you use this very general optimization algorithm called gradient descent, where you have this final loss function here, right. This is a function of x and x star and y, but it is also a function of the entries in A, B and C, right. So, I mean for our purposes here x and y, okay, I do not know why this is happening, but for our purposes here x and y, they are fixed, right, my training data set is fixed. So, I cannot actually change them. So, in this setting here x and y are not really the variables, or right. So, the variables are actually the entries in A, B and C. Is there somebody in the, anyways, let us try to okay. So, what can we do is we can, let us look at A and let us look at one entry of A, let us call it A11, right. So, I can write down the partial derivative of A11 sorry of that loss function with respect to A11, right, somehow. I mean, it exists mathematically, that much we can agree. Right. So, if we can compute those partial derivatives, right. So, what is the meaning of this partial derivative, right? That if I let us say the partial derivative of that loss with respect to a11 is positive. That means that if I increase the value of a11, the loss is going to go up, which I should not do. So, I should decrease the value of a11. Similarly, in the opposite case that will happen, right. So, we can write down the partial derivative of that loss with respect to each of the entries of A and each of the entries of B and C and so on, right. So, once I have these partial derivatives, I can adjust the values of each of these numbers using those partial derivatives. So, I slightly decrease or increase the value depending on the partial derivative, right. So, if I do that, then the loss function value that is there with these updated values, that will decrease to some extent, right. And then I will do another round of this same process, and again the loss function value will decrease at some extent. I will keep doing this as long as the loss function value keeps decreasing, and eventually it will sort of hit some plateau somewhere, right. So, you will make no more progress, and that is the point where you stop, because it seems like there is no other way to change the values that you have to decrease the loss any further. Right. So, generally in practice, when that happens, if you have designed your network properly, at that point the loss function values would be quite close to 0, which is to say that for any x, the output x star would be close to the y for that x. Right. So, at this point you stop and you have trained your neural network. This is same as when the perceptron algorithm stops, except that here you sort of stop. I mean, that algorithm would have automatically stopped, because if you recall that algorithm had a condition, right, as long as there is a misclassified point, you do something, right, update the value of w there. So, here so that algorithm also had this condition that if you think of the misclassification as a loss, right, then when it stops only when the loss hits 0 for everybody. So, here maybe hitting 0 is sort of unrealistic, but you go very close to 0 essentially, and that suffices.
So, next question will be, how much do we decrease the value or increase the value of A?
Yeah, so you decrease it by you have by some small amount, let us say 0.01 or something, by a very small amount or even smaller. Nowadays, maybe larger networks you choose something which is this. So, this is called the step size essentially. Yeah. So, you do not want to change it by too much, right, because what is the interpretation of the partial derivative, right, that at this local point, if I so the derivative of that loss with respect to this value is this, right, but if I move away from this point too far, then the derivative will also change, right. So, I might end up this is the reason essentially that I do not want to change by too much. The hope is that this point and nearby this point, the derivative values are sort of similar, right. One final thing then. So, so in perceptron and all these things we were looking at, so these were classification problems where we had two classes, positive and negative, right. So, if I were to make a neural network for that classification problem, my final layer is going to have only 2 neurons, okay, because I have only 2 classes. And what I will do is that I will interpret, so my output, let me just write it as x star 1 and x star 2. This x star 1 and x star 2, I will interpret it as a probability distribution over 2 choices. Okay. Now, the problem is that the output of a neural network, whatever it computes, it need not be a probability distribution, or constraining it to a probability distribution will make your life difficult, right. All these loss function blah blah whatever I was saying, like running gradient descent will become more painful, right, it will take longer. So, we do something very simple. Here we apply yet another nonlinear function called softmax. Okay. So, if I recall correctly, the way softmax is defined is that, so here for 2 values it is defined as, so x1 star becomes e raised to x star 1 by e raised to x star 1 plus e raised to x star 2, and this guy similarly becomes e raised to x star 2 divided by e raised to x star 1 plus e raised to x star 2. Right. I mean, for all practical purposes, this is sort of like writing x 1 by x 1 plus x 2 and x 2 by x 1 plus x 2. The way it is written like this is because this function is a bit of a smooth approximation to that thing. Right. Plus, if x 1 or x 2 were negative or something, even then this can handle this. Right. So, once you write it down in this form, the values that you will get, right, they will basically be something between 0 and 1, and in fact, like if one of them is some 5 one of them is 0.5, then the other would be 1 minus 0.5, which is Similarly, this you can write down the same thing for even multiple values like some 100 values, and once again whatever you get will become like a probability distribution over 100 values. Right. So, you interpret the output of this neural network as a probability distribution over the 2 classes or 5 classes or whatever many classes you have, and your output is basically the class with the highest probability. Right. Yeah. So, okay. So, this is basic. Sorry, can you speak up? I am not there.
Equal probability, what will happen? You said
Just pick arbitrary. Pick something arbitrary. Pick the first one.
Then it will decision is not correctly made about that plus and minus that percent.
Yeah, it doesn't matter that. Like what it means is that your network has not been properly trained yet on that. The network is not able to decide for this particular example. That's all. So it may not be the case that your neural network is successful in classifying everything. Right. Okay. So the reason I brought all these things up first is that you can see that very simple linear algebra is used in all these things, combined with a few other things, but the core part is again just vectors and matrices and things like that. Second thing I wanted to introduce was that, well, once you have these neural networks, specifically when you are working with images, so you are given a data set of images of cats and dogs, let us say, or something, and you want to classify each image as a cat or a dog, right. So, just 2 classes. So, once again you can create a neural network like this, you can choose how many neurons you want to have in the first layer, second layer, so on, how many layers you will have and so on and so forth. You are only constrained by the size of the images as input. If it is 100 by 100 pixel, then this input x is going to be like whatever 100 square, right. And because you have only 2 classes, the last layer will have only 2 neurons. Everything else you are free to choose. Once you have chosen this, you will take your training data set and using that run gradient descent. You will run that for a while until the loss function stops decreasing, right, and at that point you have fully trained your neural network. Now, this trained neural network can be used to make predictions for other images outside of the training data set. Right. Now, specifically for images, there are some other better neural networks which you can design, once again sort of utilizing like first utilizing some intuitive factors about what images are, second again some linear algebra operations. So, that is what I wanted to show here. So, if you look at this image for example, right. So, the way like at least biologically this image is processed by biological neurons is that okay. So, our eyes, right. So, they take in this whole image, but first they only look at locally small patches of this image, and based on these patches we so maybe in here we see some corner, here we see some line, here we see some other box like shape and so on. So, in our brain essentially we sort of build a map of various objects that I am seeing within this image, right, and from that map I build a more complicated map of okay. So, I see some square here and another square here and another door, another rectangle here. So, maybe this whole object represents a house, right, things like that. So, initially I mean at least biologically initially the eye, like because your eye is sort of like a screen, right, where the image is projected. each region of the eye recognizes some small patterns like this, maybe it is a slanted line, a horizontal line, vertical line, so on. So, this is what the first layer of let us say a neural network will do, recognize some small shapes. Right. The second layer of the neural network will use the information that you have recognized the shapes in various locations of the image and compose them to get more complicated shapes. The third layer of the neural network will take these more complicated shapes, compose them to get even bigger objects. So, these are called convolutional neural networks, and these work better than this sort of a general neural network, where there is no notion of in the first layer looking for small like small patterns, the second layer looking for more complex patterns, third layer looking for even bigger patterns, and so on. So, this general neural network is free to do anything, and consequently they do not perform as well as somewhat more structured neural networks, which are these neural networks. Right. So, these neural networks are so designed so that they only work like this. Right. So, let us see how this is accomplished. Okay. So, this is accomplished by using the notion of this linear algebraic operation called convolution. So, if you want to understand what is convolution, so let us look at this example here. So, here you have a big matrix, right, and because we are dealing with images, so let us think in terms of matrices. So, you have this big matrix and you have this small, let us call it a pattern, right. So, what we would like to do is sort of build a map of how well this big matrix matches with this small pattern, right, and the map naturally will be another matrix. And how is it done? So, well, I look at this guy, right, think of this as a vector in the usual way. So, this first 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9, right. So, take this and let us say superimpose, like compare this thing with this thing, right. So, this is a region of this big matrix which is of the same shape as the pattern, right, and I can think of this smaller submatrix of this big matrix again as a vector. Take the dot product of the vector from here and the vector from here, and that value will come out to be 0. Right. So, you can look at it and verify. Now, I will take what I will do is that I tried to match this pattern here with this submatrix, right. So, I now slightly shift my focus and look at this region, right, from the second column onwards to the fourth column 2 3 4 and 1 2 3. Here once again I will take a dot product of the vector form of this with the vector form of this. Now, if you do the dot product, you will get the value 30, right. And then I shift my focus, and once again this matched with this, you will again get 30 in the same manner. Similarly, I can shift my focus downwards, skipping the first row and going to the second row, and once again I will get 0 30 30 0 and so on. So, you can verify that the numbers in that matrix that we get, that is obtained by taking a dot product of this vector with vectors obtained by like consecutive submatrices of this thing, right. Or in other words, we were sort of trying to match this pattern with submatrices of this matrix, and this matching is done by simple dot product, and this dot product operation that we have done that is called a convolution. So, the convolution is producing a map of how well various regions of this big matrix match with that small pattern. Right. So, if I take, so you can see that this pattern here, like here is another example, this is a different matrix. Right. For this matrix, once again I have the same pattern, this pattern is the same as this pattern, and I try to match this pattern with this matrix, I do a convolution. This time I will get 0 minus 30 minus 30 0, right, and so on. So, if you now basically look at it this way, that pattern, as you can, it was like white and gray, let us say, right. So, let us interpret positive values as white, 0 as gray, and negative values as minus some negative numbers. So, this matrix matches with this pattern to some extent, which is why you get this 0 30 30 0 thing. That is sort of the opposite of this, right, because this was white gray, this is gray white, and this is like white gray dark, right? This is like the ulta of that. So, if you do a convolution, naturally you get this, which is showing that this pattern does not match with the, like this pattern was not matched with anything here very well, right. So, this is what convolution does, which is that there are some small patterns and it sort of builds a map of those small patterns in a matrix form of how well that pattern was matching various regions in the input, right. So, in your neural network, as I was saying, the first layer is going to look for some small objects, right, some small line or curve or whatever. So, each of these small line, curve, everything can be written down as a very small matrix, right. How would you write down, let us say this thing, right? I would probably write it as 0 0 0 1 1 1 0 0, if I were to write it 3 by 3 pattern for this. For the curve, maybe it will be something like what? Can anyone make a suggestion? 1 1 1 1 1 and then say all zeros. Right. It is not a very accurate representation, but yeah. But so you can see that this matrix sort of reflects that pattern, this matrix sort of reflects that pattern, and so on, right. So, if I were to be looking at an image and I think of this as a matrix, as we saw at the very first lecture, then by doing a convolution of this pattern matrix with this image matrix, I will basically build up a map of where all I found this pattern in the image matrix, right. And in fact, the values of the convolution, if they are large positive values, that will indicate that the pattern matched very well with that region of the image. If they are sort of 0, then the match, there was no match or mismatch. If they were negative, then that means that there was actually like the opposite of what I was expecting, right. So, this is how, given an input image, for each of these patterns, like for this pattern I will build up one map, for the second pattern I will build up a second map, for the third pattern I will build up a third map, right. So, I will get a collection of matrices which are roughly of the same size as this image matrix, with the information that the first pattern was found and this is the map of where it was found, the second pattern was found like this, third pattern was found like this. So, the first layer of the neural network builds up this information. The second layer of the neural network then builds on top of this information, right. It says that okay, you found a horizontal line here, a vertical line also nearby, and another vertical line here. That must mean that you have found a door, right, or a rectangle or a square or something, or maybe you found this is one curve, you can similarly have these other 4 curves that make up a cycle. So, maybe in one region you found these 4 curves nearby. So, that most likely indicates that I found a circle in this region that can be detected here. So, once again, how is that detection done? Again using another set of convolutions, right. So, using first set of convolutions, you find these small patterns, map of these small patterns, then you do another convolution on those maps to get map of somewhat larger patterns, another convolution on these maps to get the map of somewhat larger patterns. This keeps repeating over and over again until you have basically detected complicated objects in the image. Right. So, the idea is very clever, but the basis of like the what lies underneath is simply just dot product, right. So, here is a more realistic this thing, as I said, if this was an input image, right, and you did a detection, you applied this, you try to build a map for this particular, what is this? This is a vertical line, right. So, then the corresponding map would be the thing that you see on the left, right. Similarly, if you are looking for presence of small horizontal lines in the input image, then you can see that that would be the map, and it is actually an accurate map. For example, here, right, you have sort of a horizontal line, right, and you can see that there is a bright signal here, right, and let us say here, right, you do not have horizontal line. So, over here it is sort of dark really, right, but in this image you can see that there is a bright thing because it matched with this vertical line. Yeah. So, this is how these filters and convolutions work, right. And as I was saying, so initially even if I assume that I am working with black and white images, so in real world I actually have color images, right. So, color images are not defined by one matrix, but by 3 matrices. Now, the convolution that I defined here, this was looking for one pattern made up of a single small matrix in a larger matrix, right. But the actual inputs that you will handle will consist of multiple matrices. So, your patterns must also be made up of multiple matrices. One reason is to handle color image, another reason is that, so when you are trying to compose a bunch of small these patterns here, right, into a larger object. So, obviously, you have to look at the maps for this object, this small pattern, that small pattern, that small pattern, right. You have to look into 3 different maps and compose that information to maybe decide something about a larger shaped object. So, that is done by this very simple idea of multi-channel convolution. Right. So, your input has basically multiple matrices. So, your pattern should also have that many matrices. So, the first matrix is convolved with the first pattern, second matrix convolved with the second pattern, right, and then you just add up the output of that. Right. So, if there is a very good match in the for the first matrix with the first pattern matrix and also with the second pattern matrix, then the output signal will be strong. Right. So, this is a fancy name, but it is very straightforward. So, everyone sort of gets what is convolution and all that. How do you get that?
Just adding that matrix.
Yeah. So, you do the convolution of these two, you will get some matrix, right. You will do the convolution of these two, you will get another matrix. Add up these two matrices, you will get this matrix. I mean, you can actually try this out. I think this is actually, yeah. Right. So, here is a sort of a bigger picture of this whole operation, right. Your input, as I said, would have 3 channels, red, green and blue. It is an image with 3 channels. Now, the first layer of the convolution that looks for some simple patterns like horizontal line, vertical line, small curve, blah blah blah. So, for each pattern you have one matrix, like one map matrix, right. So, if you are looking for some 10 different patterns, then you will have 10 different matrices here. Then the second convolutional layer will use these guys and build something, right. This will be like multi-channel convolutions. So, in fact, these are also multi-channel convolutions because the input is multiple channel. So, these will again be multi-channel convolutions, but of these maps, right, and that will create a new set of maps of these filters, and naturally these filters are more complicated than these filters. Right, and then on top of this there will be another layer trying to create even more these things. This is another view of this, but I guess that is not really required. So, let me just go quickly to the bigger thing. So, this is what a CNN sort of looks like. You have this input with 3 channels, then you have some convolution, right, which builds a lot of feature maps of simple features. Let us ignore the pooling part for now. Then there will be another set of convolutions building more feature maps of more complicated features. Then again some more convolution and some more convolution, and finally, you have built up maps of lots of complicated features. So, based on that information, now you have some simple fully connected layers like what I was showing originally, and that basically takes all this processed information and produces some decision out of it. Right. So, this is the structure of convolutional neural networks. Right. It is very simple, at least mathematically. The complexity is that there are like many such layers. Right. So, there is this one operation pooling I have not explained, I will explain it just now, but do you have any questions about any of these things? Okay, so let us quickly look at pooling, why it is needed and why do we want to do this. Pooling is basically doing this. Okay. So, like if I have this image, right, and I do 2 by 2 pooling, what I will do is that I will take like some 2 nearby pixels here, like a 2 by 2 submatrix here, and say write down the average or the maximum value here in this corner. Right. So, this is what pooling is doing. Like, okay, here is a better example, that if I had this big matrix and I applied 2 by 2 pooling, then I will, I do not know, maybe this is the average of those guys. So, that is written here. Right. Similarly, the average of these guys is this. So, that is written here and so on. Right. So, what I was saying, this would be average pooling. Similarly, you can have max pooling, which would take the max of these 4 values. Sorry, this looks like a max match pooling.
Max pooling.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so max pooling is the most common thing, but I was just trying to explain what pooling is, right? It's a very simple like aggregation operation. And why we need this is for the following reason, that so when I look at my image and I build a feature map of these small things, right. So, what was the size of my feature maps? Typically, these feature maps are defined by matrices of size say 3 by 3 or 5 by 5, right. Anything more it just becomes costly for no reason. So, feature maps always have this small size, right. There will be a 3 by 3 or 5 by 5 matrix, something like this. But now that I have taken my image and I have built up feature maps for these simple horizontal and vertical lines, if I am looking for larger objects, right, then naturally the size of a larger object could be 10 pixels by 10 pixels or even 20 pixels by 20 pixels or something, right. So, how can I use a 3 by 3 filter to detect a 20 by 20 image object in the image? We cannot. Right. So, this is why I have to take these outputs of the first layer and use pooling to reduce the size. Right. Now, the image becomes smaller, a 20 by 20 size object becomes 10 by 10 or maybe 5 by 5, and I can then use a 5 by 5 filter to detect it. That is essentially one of the reasons we do pooling. So, there are also a bunch of other practical reasons. Another way of using pooling is that, for example, if the input image has an object, right, maybe the object is slightly rotated or shifted or something. So, pooling sort of automatically takes care of those things in the image, right. So, this sort of makes your neural network sort of more robust to a slight variations in the input. Right. And once again, pooling is again a very simple operation. It's not even linear algebra. It's like high school math level thing. So here is basically a convolutional neural network, which I would say these things are very commonly used nowadays, right. They do some very amazing things, like you give it an image of some bird, it can tell you the species of that bird, right, something that most people cannot do, or unless you are trained for many years, right, you have done a PhD on birds or something, it's probably you cannot do, but these networks can do very easily. It will even run on your phone, right. So, the basis of this networks, they are very simple things just like this, right. There is nothing, no super fancy things happening. So, the fancy thing that is happening is that we do not know why these things work, right. So, there are people who are studying why these things work or why they do not work or so on and so forth, and there they try to understand some very, I do not know what they try to, like they try to understand the space of the features and why is it that gradient descent leads you to good features and things like that, right. So, that is some very sophisticated thing which I am not prepared to explain, or I would say even know very well, right. So, we do not really know why neural networks work so well, but they work, right. The only thing is that they require lots of data and lots of computational power to train. After that they work very well, and they will work on your phone or anything like that, like most of the typical things. Nowadays, you have these much larger networks which will not run on your phone, but people are figuring out ways to make them smaller and more compact, and eventually they will also run on your phone. Anyway, so this is what I wanted to discuss for today. Once again, like how these very simple objects, like just simple vectors and dot product of vectors and so on and so forth, can capture a lot of this information, right, and they can be so effectively utilized. So, there is a lot of other stuff here which I do not really want to go into, because they are not relevant. Right. Also, we have reached the end of our session time. So, let us stop here. Oh, screen was not being shared or something, is it? Hopefully, the camera caught this. Okay, so any questions, or shall we just stop?